So what we have here are some practice questions for those who need a little bit of refresher on how these questions are structured, the exam type questions that you'll see in an English B exam. The questions have 4 parts essentially. The first part is going to be just a prompt, and it will look like this. Pretty much, that's your question prompt, like a little intro to the question. The forest of stories serves as a beacon of hope and an escape from the grim reality of the slave ship. And then we're going to have a 3-part question following that. So, in this case, write an essay in which you describe one instance where the forest of stories offers some solace or wisdom to a character on the slave ship, and one instance highlighting the harsh conditions that a character faces on the ship. So this is all part 1, right? And part 1 is going to ask you to write about 2 things. So maybe one for one character, one for another character, one from one place, one from another place. You're going to write about 2 things. Part 2 of the question will ask you to write about one thing. One of the 2 things that you wrote about in the first part, you're going to focus on that for part 2. In this case, for one of the instances describe how it significantly impacts one character's outlook or actions. And the third part of the question will ask you to look at some kind of device or technique. Finally, you must examine how the contrast between these settings is used as a dramatic technique to highlight the power of storytelling. So this is the structure of your English B question, and you will recognize the structure across all of the genres. Your poetry question, your drama question, your narrative question, they will all look the same in terms of the format, pretty much the same. A few variations might be there in the last part, but roughly the same. So what we'll do today is we'll look at a couple of these questions. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about approaches or points you could make, and then we'll discuss and see if we can maybe come to some kind of consensus as to what might be the most effective points to bring into the discussion. So why don't we start with this one that we've highlighted? So make sure you understand the question well. That's step 1. Yeah. The forest of stories, remember, Anansi is written in 2 settings running side by side. We have the forest and we have the slave ship. So the forest of stories serves as a beacon of hope and an escape, right? Keywords here, hope, right? The forest of stories, they give hope to woman and girl, and also escape from the grim reality of the slave ship. And so when you're planning the points where essay, you're going to plan based on these 3 sections here, 1, 2, 3, right? You're going to write an essay in which you describe one instance in the forest of stories where one instance offers solace or wisdom to a character on the ship. So in your planning, you need to single out one instance there, and also another instance highlighting the harsh conditions that a character faces on the ship. So plan out those 2 instances, and then you're going to choose one of the 2 and talk about how a character's outlook or actions would have been impacted to decide that one. And then you're going to look at contrast between the settings and how that is used as a technique to highlight power of storytelling, right? So you're going to look at contrast and its relationship to storytelling. After 2 more minutes, I'm going to need 2 volunteers to share what they have.
So can I try?
Yes, Vashti.
All right. Okay. So this is the kind of question that I really need to think about for a few days before I can attempt it. But nonetheless, here's what I'm going to go with. Now, the one instance where the forest of stories offers solace or wisdom to a character on the slave ship, that one instance, I'm going to refer to that moment when woman and girl are having what would effectively be their final story, I think, is the way where she speaks about when the sailor and boy are making reference to her possibly becoming ill, and then sailor says she refers to the mother and she says they don't come in one size, they come in different sizes, is what the woman says. And she says, girl says, it's like spinning our secret, like spinning that's our secret, like spinning the web. Woman tells her, now show your strength. So this is the point where the forest of stories starts reflecting what strength should look like.
Can you tell me where that is, Vashti?
It's on page 22, sir.
Okay, you have the page number. All right. Let's see.
Yeah. So that is Act 3 on board.
Okay, so around
So
it's
it's
around here.
right. So that, yeah, it's right there. It's right there. She says, I know, mother, that's our secret. Like spinning the web. All right. Um,
Mm.
so girl is already going to get the analogy that comes together with that particular moment when she understands that these white people come in different sizes, and woman tells her the final story, and that's the story of Man Crew. So when they transport themselves to Man Crew, to the story with Man Crew, that's when the solace comes, when girl realizes the power of those 6 arrows. That's on page 26. That would be chapter 4, right? So the first part, girl actually resorts to going with mother into the forest of stories to find solace and power and wisdom in how do we deal with the trauma that's going on with us down in the hole. So that's what I would start with as one of the instances that speaks directly about the forest of stories that offers solace and wisdom to the character. In this case, it's girl going through another story with woman in the forest of stories. The story of reference there would be Man Crow and Soliday, Grant finally telling Soliday about these 6 arrows, and that the final one is really the arrow that counts. And this is the secret held only by you. Funny enough, they actually mentioned, girl says it. She says, that's our secret. That story comes back. That word secret comes back. And then she says finally, now, Grant says to Soliday, now go without a word. You have everything you need. All right. So I would have said that would have been the first instant. That harsh instance would be the moment when that part on page 22, where for the final time, woman, she doesn't know it, but woman's going to get thrown overboard because she's old and ill. And that would be the harsh reality that girl would face. And this would be the story, the reference she would make to give her solace when that moment comes. Now go without a word. You have everything you need. All right.
All right, that's good. So we have the 6 arrows being the focal point of that forest story, offering wisdom and hope, and then we have woman's fate, right, on the ship. So one instance highlighting the harsh conditions would be so woman's fate on the ship. She's about to be thrown overboard, and girl doesn't necessarily realize that basically until it happens. And we don't really get to see the details of the realization, but it's definitely implied. All right. So that would be a nice plan of action for the first part, the first body paragraph. So what about the second paragraph, Ashley? Which one of these would you zone in on?
I think I would zone in on those 6 arrows, to be honest with that story, because when Soliday is of the opinion that he's going to get the answer he's going to get the name, or Grant's going to provide him with the name for all of these arrows, when in truth and in fact, it is the 6th arrow that weighs the most. And if I'm going to be looking at this, I would describe that when Grant talks about those 6 arrows, and it is only then Soliday comes to the realization that it is really up to him how strong he is mentally and physically, and if he's listened to the wisdom of hope and the emancipation that he should feel from the horrors of Man Crew. That is where I would then imply that that's how girl's going to receive it. She's got everything she needs now. She's got to find the 6th arrow inside of her. And it is from that moment that she will effectively leave her childhood behind, hold on to her cultural identity, and survive the harsh life that she's about to encounter. I don't know if that's going to work, but
All right, yeah. So girl learns that true strength or true power comes from within, from this story. Because
yes.
the other external factors, they're not the make or break arrow. It's the last one that's an internal drive. And each person has to find for themselves. And girl would have learned that lesson through this story. So that's a way in which girls outlook, not necessarily actions, but her outlook would have been impacted. So that's fine. Because we could look at outlook or actions. So for girl, it would be outlook. For Mancro, it might be actions. For Soliday, if you wanted to focus on Soliday and how he ends up defeating Mancro, then we could look at his actions. But for girl, it's more what she would have learned from the story. All right. That makes sense. That makes sense. What about the last section here? This last section is it's a heavy question, to be honest. We look at the contrast. We already understand the contrast between the two settings.
Okay.
But now we have to look at how that this is the hard part.
Yes.
We have to look at how it highlights the power of storytelling.
Okay. So if I am looking at, you must examine how the contrast. So first thing I'll take it from what is exactly the contrast here, right? Well, the contrast for me would be that woman and girl are down, or girl is now, despite everything that's around her, she is learning to quote unquote dream in the dark. Now, the actions that take place here is, as I said, she's dreaming in the dark. She's got to learn to maneuver herself in darkness, a very dark time in her life that might actually extend until she dies. But she learns the strength in the darkness. Now, Soliday now, the contrast here, the parallel storyline is that the dramatic technique of having Soliday with these arrows. Now, I could be wrong, yeah. So I told you I need to think about this particular question. It's heavy for me too. Now, the contrast is woman and girl in that pitch darkness, and they seeing the eventual end of what could happen to woman eventually. Now, Soliday now is in the forest of stories. Soliday is fighting Mancro, which apparently looks like it's happening in the morning, all right, or sometime during the early part of the day. And sir, I'm going to stop right about here. I'm going to stop here. I know I'm kind of thinking about something, but I feel I'm going to run off the track. I'm going to run off my train track right now.
All right, let's see if we can stay on the tracks together, right? Because so far the essence coming together. We have the first two parts, which is we see how kind of low battery. All right, let me plug this in. Yeah, can't have any mishaps right about no. All right, so we see how the Forester stories provide wisdom to girl, and we see one instance of the harsh condition, that's fine. We see how the story of the 6 arrows would have impacted girl's outlook. So now we'll go back to the contrast, the dark ship versus the Forester stories. How does this relate to the power of storytelling? So the story being told, first of all, that we could continue to focus on is the story of Mancro's defeat. This could be the story, because if we're looking at the power of storytelling, we want one story, because the Forester stories is a collection, it's an anthology, right? So we'd want to keep focused on one story and how the power of storytelling shines through that one story being told. So we can stick to Mancro's story or Soliday's story, right? Whoever you see as the star of that story. So the contrast here, used as a dramatic technique, how does this highlight how powerful storytelling is? Well, it is through the story being told, the story of Mancro's defeat, right? And we know that this is happening within the contrast of worlds, the dark, real world versus the fantastical, kind of bright world. The world gets bright when Mancro is defeated. It says darkness has turned into light or something like that. So how is storytelling a powerful tool because of this contrast? Well, the storytelling is what allows girl to learn the lesson of the inner strength. So we would basically continue our point here. We would go based off this point. If girl learns to have a new outlook based on this story, then obviously storytelling is a powerful thing because it is actually impacting a character outside of the story, which is girl. Girl is in real life, right? So what about the contrast? How does the contrast relate to the power of storytelling? Well, we can go back to the dark versus light imagery. We have one setting that is dark, both literally and metaphorically, and one setting that is bright, literally and metaphorically, right? And so the power of storytelling is that girl becomes enlightened through the storytelling. The storytelling enlightens girl's dark world. Dark, meaning hopeless, ignorant, confused. And the contrast is important because what if the story was also dark? What if there was no contrast between the story being told and the real world? What if the story was just as depressing as the slave ship? Then would the storytelling have been an effective way to change girl? Would it have been a powerful technique? Would it have been powerful at all? It wouldn't have been. It is only because the story being told is in contrast with the reality. That is the only reason why it works, right? So we have to explain what the contrast is, which is easy. We have the real world, which is dark and dreary and grim and hopeless, versus the forest where anything is possible. So how does this contrast highlight how powerful storytelling is? Well, it is only because there's a contrast between the story and the real world why a girl can't get anything from it. Girl wouldn't benefit from a story that did not contrast with the reality. So we can look at the kind of power and light that is in the forest. Soliday has all of this power, which girl doesn't have, right? The Forester story has all of this light, which the slave ship doesn't have. So this is a way to introduce new concepts and kind of balance the scales just because we have that contrast. The second part of this question kind of leads to the last part of it. We look at how girl benefits from learning about the arrows, but then in the last part we have to look at why is the contrast important? How does the contrast make the storytelling a more powerful tool? And it's because the contrast allows girl to access ideas and powers and spirituality that is just impossible on the dark ship. You need that contrast in order for a girl to get anything from it. And then we could look at the power of storytelling through the lens of contrast on the audience as well. So we'll look at how girl benefits from the power of storytelling that comes through by the contrast. But what about the audience themselves? Imagine you're sitting in the not the stands. What do you call wherever we sit at a play? Right? We're sitting in the crowd. Whatever. That word is there, but I don't know it right. We're sitting there and we're observing what's happening on the ship. For us, the viewers know the ship is the real world that we're immersed in. And then all of a sudden, whenever the Forester story comes to mind, the setting changes and we're able to get in a different state of mind. It is that contrast between the two worlds that allows us to really get into the forest, to really see Anansi as being so different from anything real. So strong, so much stronger than anything that girl has to deal with. So much more powerful, right? Imagine if the storytelling that was happening did not have the contrast. So we go from the slave ship to a dungeon instead of the Forester stories. Would we be able to appreciate the power of storytelling if we just move from darkness to darkness? There would be no power. The stories being told wouldn't have any weight because what's the point of telling a story that is the same as my reality? And that's why some books are boring because they're too close to reality. We can't get anything from it because I just feel like I'm reading about my daily life. You want the story that you're being told to be very different from what you're experiencing, and that is how you can take something new to your experience, right? So this question is a little complicated at the end because it forces us to look at two things. Usually we have to look at only one aspect, which might be storytelling or it might be contrast. But no, they give you contrast and the power of storytelling, and they tell you find the relationship between the two. Tell me how one highlights the other. And so we're forced to make that connection. But I hope that was a clear explanation of how the contrast between the settings is used to highlight how powerful storytelling is, as a tool. Because what we're doing is we're linking two dramatic techniques. Storytelling is a technique and contrast is a technique. So the question is saying, how do these two techniques work together? And that would be my answer. All right. Did you have any other ideas about how we could approach this question? Nobody else dared to challenge this one?
Sir, excuse me. So this latter part here is more about, could I then issue that it's through the contrast and the storytelling you get moral lessons and wisdom being administered through this particular technique?
Well, the focus on this last part here, right? Because it says you must examine how the contrast between settings is used as a technique to highlight the power of storytelling. So we already know the power of storytelling. What you just mentioned would be the power of storytelling. Through the storytelling, girl is able to learn lessons. There's the spiritual growth. There's the understanding of self. That is all the power of storytelling. But this question isn't just saying, tell me about storytelling and how powerful that is. It's saying, tell me about why contrast is used to make storytelling more powerful. So then we couldn't stop at just saying, okay, girl can learn about this and that, and there are these lessons. We would have to say there's a contrast between the stories and the reality. And that is why the stories are so strong, because of the contrast. So we would have to look at the contrast in like the mood, the contrast in the characterizations between the forest and the slave ship, for example. Characters in the forest. Anansi can do anything. Soliday, he's firing off arrows. So these characters are powerful. They can do things compared to girl and woman who are stuck. So it is the contrast, it is the big difference between the two worlds that makes the stories work, right? So we're looking at contrast, the difference between the two worlds, and how that contrast is a technique that makes the stories more powerful, right? Contrast is between these settings is used as a dramatic technique to highlight the power of storytelling. So we can imagine the stories would be less powerful without the contrast. And that's kind of what we want to prove in the essay. We want to prove how the contrast is what shows us how powerful the stories are, right? I think the stories would be much less impactful if there was no contrast, right? If every time woman told a story, it was about how Anansi lost a battle and how he got killed. What would be the point? What would be the benefit? Right? What could girl learn from depressing stories like that? But because of the contrast, because girl can see something that is the opposite of what she's experiencing now, she can see the opposite of that in the stories. Then the storytelling has more power to it, more weight, right? On the slave ship, the African characters are oppressed, but in the forest, the African characters are very powerful. Anansi's an African character, right? Soliday is an African character. And they are the ones winning. We see her being defeated. We see Mancro being defeated. So that contrast highlights how powerful the storytelling is. It's because of the stark difference between the worlds. Yeah. Whether or not you would easily express all of that in one paragraph is another issue. This could end up being a 6-paragraph essay where you have a regular intro, paragraph, and you might spend 2 paragraphs here if it's a more complex idea. The 5 paragraphs thing is kind of it's an estimate, but some essays require 6 paragraphs in order for you to really get into the juice, the meat of the matter.